with some of the recent videos I've put up, leaving comments and the like. It's good for the algorithm. And I always forget that I lose connection when I leave my house because it goes off the Wi-Fi. Anyway, today we're going to have a break from the defense of moral realism discussions that we've been doing the last few times, and I'm going to cover something a bit different. I've been thinking a bit about this lately, so I wanted to share thoughts on this issue that historically, and by this I mean, I don't know, at least the last few decades, atheism has focused, like organized atheism or atheists in popular debates and such, have focused on responding to arguments that Christians and others, that I'll focus on Christianity here, have given for the truth of their religious claims, right? So we respond to the cosmological argument and the teleological argument and the moral argument and so on. And, you know, that's fine as far as it goes, but I think that there's more to do than simply respond to arguments that Christians give for believing in the existence of God or accepting Christianity. And we need to go further than simply saying that the evidence or the arguments aren't good enough. I think that we also need to critique aspects of the Christian worldview or other worldviews, but again, focus on Christian here, that in themselves don't make a lot of sense or don't provide very good explanations for the world. So, for example, suppose Christianity really did provide a good explanation for the resurrection. I don't think it does, but let's just suppose for the sake of argument that it did. That would have to be weighed or balanced against any internal problems that Christianity had as a theory. And I think there are quite a lot of problems, internal problems that Christianity has as a theory, and which we can think of as sort of theological issues or theological problems. And so even me, sort of thinking back on my journey, I hadn't paid so much attention to Christian theology because I thought that's sort of an internal matter and it maybe doesn't matter so much from an apologetic standpoint or a counter-apologetic standpoint. But I'm increasingly thinking that's wrong because we need to assess the plausibility and explanatory context, and explanatory competencies and powers of Christianity as a worldview. And theology is absolutely relevant to that. So I think that we should be providing positive arguments against the plausibility of certain Christian theological claims as a counter or as a component of our counter-apologetic strategy. So it's not just the case that Christianity that there aren't very good arguments for Christianity, but there's actually positive arguments against it because of its various internal problems and implausibilities. And so that's the framework that I'm increasingly thinking that we should adopt. If we're focusing on comparative worldviews, then we need to think about the internal tensions within Christianity. Of course, there are many different theological positions within Christianity, and I think that the most important aspects to focus on, therefore, are those that are most core to Christianity as a worldview. Of course, there can be more specific aspects that we discuss, you know, if we're talking to people from a particular tradition, but I think as a general strategy, we should focus on the most fundamental issues first, and some of those are the most problematic. That's a double aspect there. So I've been thinking about is the Incarnation, and this is one of the core areas that's discussed as a within the sort of rubric of Christian philosophy or philosophy of religion with a particular focus on Christianity. A couple of other sort of core areas that I would mention are the Trinity and the nature of sin, and also Jesus' atoning sacrifice. Sin and atonement obviously go together. So I might talk about those a little bit, but let's start with the Incarnation. This is all of these topics that I just mentioned, including the Incarnation, are pretty foundational. It's not like there are only some Christian denominations that believe in the Incarnation. Effectively, they all do, and almost all believe in the Trinity, and all Christians believe in at least some notion of, you know, Jesus' atoning sacrifice and the concept of sin. So they're very foundational things. They're not specific to just one denomination or some denominations. And you know, the Incarnation is sort of one of the foundational claims of Christianity, that God came to earth as a man who was Jesus, who then died and was atoned for our sins and resurrected, right? That this is absolutely foundational. The question then is, what does it mean for Jesus or for God to come to earth, to incarnate as a man? How can we understand that? So that's the issue that I want to discuss a bit here. And just as a further preface, I understand that there are different there are different theories that different theologians have come up with over the time, and I'm not terribly familiar with them. I've done a little bit of perusing here and there, so I'll mention some of the things that I found, but I fully acknowledge that I need to learn more about this, and partly that's why I'm making this video, is just a way of sort of sharing some thoughts. And so I'm sure there are other thinkers who have more to say on this, and this isn't supposed to be the final word or anything. But nevertheless, I do think that it's an important thing for atheists to be thinking about. So the incarnation, right? So the idea is that God, who is omnipotent and omnibenevolent, who is outside of, well, at least outside of space, and some people think it's also outside of time, doesn't have a body, and is all powerful and all that, somehow becomes a man. And of course, men are limited and not omnipotent and not omnibenevolent, and men have faults and so forth. So there's this issue of inconsistent or irreconcilable properties, right? How can God be all-knowing as God, but also not all-knowing as a man? Or how can God be perfect, but imperfect as a human? How can God be immaterial, but then take up a material body? Doesn't really seem to make a lot of sense. So there have been, of course, attempts to sort of reconcile these. So one approach is to say that God has his properties in sort of different, he holds them in sort of different ways, right? So, for example, or different modes might be a better way to say it. So if you were to say that God is all-knowing, you might say that God, maybe I should say Jesus, actually, because we're talking about the incarnation here. So Jesus as God is all-knowing, but Jesus as a man is not all-knowing. So you have to like distinguish the kind of nature that you're talking about, or maybe nature's not the right word, but the component or aspect or mode of his nature. I'm sure theologians will argue about exactly what word's the right one to choose, but the basic idea is that you kind of distinguish two different ways that Jesus has properties. And to me, this doesn't, and to others as well, this doesn't seem like a very convincing response, because, for example, if you want to say that Jesus as God is all-knowing, but Jesus as a man is not all-knowing, Jesus is still supposed to be one being or one entity. So you can still ask the question, well, but is Jesus himself all-knowing or not? And it seems that it's not enough just to say Jesus as God is and Jesus as man isn't. I mean, but is Jesus all-knowing? How do you reconcile him having both of those natures at the same time? So merely saying that there's sort of two ways he can have a property doesn't seem to answer that question. It almost seems like a verbal trick, right? So if we put aside that approach, a different approach is to say that, well, actually God gave up some of his properties when he incarnated. So this is, I think Swinburne might think this, at least about some things. So Jesus was not actually omniscient, or was not actually all powerful in the incarnation or during the incarnation, or however you want to phrase that. That property was sort of given up by God as part of the incarnation. Now, that raises some interesting questions, such as, well, does that include the fact that God is omnibenevolent? Like, could Jesus then make mistakes or commit sins? Now, traditionally, of course, Christians have thought that Jesus lived a sinless life, but if I don't know how, as a man, you can not ever sin or make mistakes. That seems to be pretty essential to the notion of being a man to me, like being a person. And if God can retain his sinless nature, then why couldn't he retain the all-powerful, all-knowing nature? I don't know, maybe there's a difference there. There's probably more to be said there. But another problem, possibly a bigger problem, is that God is supposed to have these properties of like omniscience and omnibenevolence. Essentially, they're not like an add-on, they're an essential part of his nature. This is particularly, going through a tunnel now, just in case the signal gets worse, this is particularly relevant in arguments like the ontological argument, which will attempt to say, well, God is the greatest conceivable being or the greatest possible being or whatever, who essentially has all of these properties. This type of language is also used to justify why God is actually a simple postulate rather than like a complex being or a complicated postulate, because all of his attributes he has essentially, and so you don't have to postulate them separately. That's kind of like only counts as one, so to speak. But then if it seems, but then if you want to say that God can actually give up some of these properties like omniscience and omnipotence and maybe others, then I mean you can't give up an essential property. It's not really an essential property anymore if that property can change and you still be the same thing. Like the whole point of an essential property is that it's sort of constitutive of what you are, that you have that property. I'm just trying to think of a clear example. I suppose the very idea of essential properties is somewhat controversial. For example, well, maybe one example would be to say that there's a plant which can't photosynthesize. Now, normally being able to photosynthesize would be considered to be a sort of a definitional or constitutive property of being a plant. I suppose if we did find something that looked like a plant that couldn't photosynthesize, we might have to decide how to classify it. But the point is, if you think of being able to photosynthesize as an essential characteristic and definitional component of being a plant, you couldn't have a plant that just sort of stopped photosynthesizing. Not because it was dead, but just like it just sort of sometimes didn't do that. That wouldn't really be count as a plant, would it? Because that's supposed to be part of what it makes it a plant, or like a mammal that doesn't have fur or mammary glands or something like that, right? It's supposed to be essential to it. And these things are definitely, these sort of properties are supposed to be essential to God's nature. So how can he give them up? He wouldn't be God anymore if it wasn't omniscient, right? Or omnipotent or whatever else. So, I mean, some people may just bite the bullet and say, well, you know, God can do that if he wants to. But at least for me and for others, that seems like a not very plausible strategy to say that God can give up essential properties like that. So if that strategy is given up, what else is there? Well, one approach or series of approaches that I read about is essentially just to say that, I mean, God does have multiple properties at once, and that's just kind of okay. Like they'll say that God is, I should say Jesus, like God in the Incarnation. So Jesus is all-knowing, and also Jesus is not all-knowing. And that's just okay. So apparently there's one scholar who, I was just reading about this on the Stanford Encyclopedia. Apparently there's one scholar who said that that's not a contradiction. I don't quite understand why, but they've got some argument to say why that's not contradictory in the case of Jesus. But then there's another approach which says, no, that is contradictory. Jesus is a contradictory being. That's actually a very interesting approach. It's kind of moving beyond classical logic. I feel like a lot of Christians are probably not going to be okay with that, though, to say that God is a contradictory, or I should say Jesus is a contradictory being. But anyway, so those are some of the approaches that I've come across. I'm sure there are many more, and as I said, I wanted to learn more about this. But I just wanted to give you a flavor of what I found out about. And I guess the point I want to make is that none of those seem very satisfying to me. The idea that Jesus can have properties as God and then as a man doesn't seem to really get to the core issue for me. It seems like a verbal trick. The idea that God can give up essential properties doesn't really seem to work. And the idea that it's just sort of okay for God to have these apparently or maybe even actually contradictory properties doesn't seem to actually address the issue very well. So I'm not really convinced. I just don't think it makes sense. I think it's kind of either inconceivable or impossible to have a being that is all divine and all man, or fully divine and fully man, which is at least what many Christians believe. I just don't think that works. And the thing is, if that doesn't work, then Christianity is kind of done, right? Like you just, like incarnation is pretty core, or at least Orthodox Christianity. Like I'm sure there are ways you could get around that if you might want to give that up as more of a heterodox theological understanding of the incarnation. But for the most part, I think many Christians aren't going to be very satisfied with that. And for them, it's going to be pretty core to Christianity that, you know, God did incarnate as Jesus, and that Jesus is, at least in some sense, fully God and fully man. And if you can't make sense of that, then Christianity is in trouble. Now, I'm not saying this is a knockdown argument. I'm saying that I need to learn more about this, and I'm sure there are more approaches. But I think it is a serious issue. I don't think I'm alone in saying that. I think even many Christian philosophers would say that this is an important issue. And so, as an apologetic, it's coming back to the sort of connection to a counter-apologetics. I think that atheists and agnostics should use this in discussions of this issue and in debates and arguments about this issue. We should put this out as something that counts against the plausibility of Christianity as a good candidate explanation for phenomena in the world. It has this glaring internal tension, which is hard to reconcile. We don't need to say that it's literally impossible, but it's just about plausibilities, right? It's sort of like the problem of evil, but this one's specific to Christianity. Like Islam still has a problem of evil, for example, but obviously they don't believe in the Incarnation, so that's not relevant to them, or Judaism. So I think that this should be added to the atheist arsenal as an argument against Christianity, and I think that this is the sort of thing that we should be raising more often, because I think that many Christians have thought about the problem of evil, at least in some respect, and I think that can still be a powerful argument. But raising some more of these theological issues that possibly they've never considered before in any depth, or have just sort of been told, don't worry about it, at least to have the atheist or agnostic raising them in a debate context or a discussion or whatever other context, I think might be valuable and have some rhetorical force, in addition to, I think, just being generally good questions to raise. So this is something I'm hoping to do a bit more of on my channel, and maybe I'll do some writings about this at some point, so stay tuned for that. But I've got a bit more time on my drive, so maybe I'll mention one of the other of these areas that I think is potentially worthy of further discussion. So I just talked about the Incarnation. But another of these areas is the Atonement, also the idea that Jesus died and was raised to atone for our sins. Now, let me explain what my opinion is on the idea of the atonement as a doctrine. Well, it relates to the Incarnation as well, but maybe slightly more directly. In my opinion, Jesus' initial followers, his disciples, believed that Jesus was the Messiah. Well, I mean, everyone agrees on that, but they believed that he was the Messiah in the traditional Jewish sense, which was that he would be a great religious leader who would restore Israel to its former might, the kingdom of Israel and the people, and drive out the Romans and fulfill all the Old Testament prophecies and all of that. That's what they thought Jesus would do as the Messiah, right? And they didn't have any belief about him dying or being resurrected or being the incarnation of God or being an atoning sacrifice or any of those things, because none of those things were part of the Jewish conception of the Messiah. So where did those things come from? Well, in my opinion, those things came from the disciples who, in the aftermath of Jesus's crucifixion, were trying to figure out how to make sense of, well, why did Jesus, how could the Messiah, because they still believe Jesus was the Messiah, right? They're trying to deal with that cognitive dissonance. How could he be the Messiah but then be crucified before he'd restored Israel and fulfilled all these prophecies and so forth? And, perhaps prompted by hallucinations or even the empty tomb, because I think the tomb may well have been empty, they came up with this idea of Jesus had been resurrected. But then, of course, when you have an idea that Jesus is resurrected, you need an explanation. But why has he been resurrected? Why did he die in the first place, and why is he now being resurrected? And that's when the idea of being an atoning sacrifice came in, of course, because this idea of offering a blood sacrifice was very critical to Jewish thought. That's what many of the temple performances were, like offering sacrificial animals for different types of sins and so forth. So this idea is part of Jewish thought. What wasn't part of Jewish thought was the idea that there would be like a single atoning sacrifice for all of mankind that would come in the person of the Messiah. But this is something, I don't know if the disciples came up with this or this came a little bit later, but it seems that Paul is more or less teaching this only a couple of decades afterwards. So it seems to have arisen fairly early. I'm sure other scholars will be able to say a lot more than I can about it. But the only point I'm making here is that I believe that the doctrines of the Incarnation and the Atonement came up as a post hoc justification for why it is that it made sense that Jesus would be crucified and then resurrected, because you have to account for that in your theology. So I think that's where they came from. The issue then is, can we make sense of this theologically or philosophically? Christians are, in a sense, committed to making sense of it because it's how their whole religion is justified. Otherwise, why did Christ die, and why was he allegedly raised, right? Like, it wasn't just for funsies. It was supposed to be because he was the incarnation of God who offered himself as a salvific sacrifice on behalf of mankind. That's the justification, right? If that justification doesn't make sense, then again, all of Christianity is in trouble. And every Christian of any sort believes at the minimum that Jesus offered himself as an atonement for humankind. They may not believe in like penal substitution or whatever, but they believe in some sense that he performed some kind of atonement for mankind. I think that's a very minimal conception of what you have to believe to be a Christian. So this is very core. And then we ask the question, well, like, how does that work? How does the atonement work? What was Jesus doing? Why did God need an atoning sacrifice, etc., right? And I think the whole issue is very poorly motivated from the outset. Jews didn't believe that God required an atoning sacrifice for mankind, or even for Jews, right? Yes, there were sacrifices as part of their custom, but they weren't universal sacrifices. Like particular people offered sacrifices for themselves or family or whatever, but not for like all of humankind. And other salvific religions, such as certain theistic forms of Hinduism, such as Buddhism and Islam, which is another monotheistic religion. None of these religions require any sort of atoning sacrifice for God, or to deal with our sins. So why does Christianity think that we need one? Like, it doesn't really seem that there's good theological motivation here. At least many other religions haven't thought so, and Jews didn't think so. Is there a good a priori reason outside of the fact that Jesus, was resurrected, or claims to have been resurrected? Is there good reason to think that we need any such thing as an atoning sacrifice? I'm not sure that there is. So the usual explanation that Christians give is that of a there's a couple of sort of metaphors that are used. I think the most common one is the courtroom one, right? Where it's, well, someone's done a wrong, they need to be punished for the wrong, and so the judge hands down the verdict. But the judge then is, if the judge is sufficiently merciful in order to try to satisfy mercy alongside justice, the judge may take upon themselves the punishment that they inflicted on the person, right? So, they take the lashes, or they take the fine, or whatever it is. And this is a way of, so basically offering oneself as the judge as a sacrifice, or to take on the punishment, is a way of satisfying justice and mercy at the same time. Because you have to have the punishment to satisfy justice, but then you don't want to actually inflict it to satisfy mercy, so the judge takes it on themselves. At least this is what I've heard, and I think that this is not the only way to understand the term, but it is a pretty popular way. I guess this is a form of penal substitution, although maybe there's nuances there that I'm not aware of, but that's at least the basic idea. Now, this idea has never made any sense to me at all, despite talking to people. I've talked to quite a few Christians about this and tried to understand it. And I've actually read some books on the atonement, although this was a few years ago, but I still don't really get it. Is it The Cross of Christ? I think that's one that I read years ago. I forget who the author was. But anyways, first of all, I don't think that in any other context we would ever accept someone we certainly wouldn't accept a judge taking a punishment on behalf of the criminal. No one would say that that's appropriate. That's just a conflict of interest, a miscarriage of justice, unfair. So I don't really understand that analogy at the get-go. It seems completely inappropriate to me that would ever happen. Now, maybe you'd say, well, look, it's just an analogy. In the human space, it doesn't make sense, but in the God, because he's God, he can do it. But I'm not sure. Like, well, then what's the point of the analogy if it doesn't really make any sense? I'm not sure the fact that God is all just and all-knowing really changes anything there. It's just not appropriate to inflict a punishment on someone other than the person who did the wrong. Even a case like a fine, where someone might have a fine that they have to pay, and maybe then their friends lend them money or their family gives them money to pay the fine. That is something we allow. It'd be kind of hard to disallow that, I suppose. But even then, I think many people would say, well, that's the way things go. But it's not great. It's not really very fair that happened. They should have to bear the fine themselves and not just be able to ask people who they know to pay it for them. And so in a perfect system, like if there's an omnibenevolent God and omniscient God in charge of everything, I don't think even somehow he'd find a way to ensure that the person on whom the punishment is inflicted is actually the person who did the wrong. So this whole idea of one person taking the punishment for someone else seems fundamentally unjust and inappropriate to me for any kind of system of punishment. Even if it's God taking the punishment, that it doesn't really make sense to me at all. Another issue, though, is what is the nature of this punishment anyway? I mean, we can understand the idea that if you harm or wrong someone else, then there's an appropriate punishment that you should have to bear for that. And the punishment should be proportional, it should fit the crime, and it should, focus on protecting people and disincentivizing you of doing it again, and this sort of thing, right? That's all fine. But what is exactly supposed to be the appropriate punishment for sin? And what is the nature of the wrong done by sin anyway? Because, the nature of sin is not just it's a wrong, it's a wrong against God. I don't even know that I understand the nature of sin. In my opinion, you can only wrong someone by harming them. And I know that that is maybe a bit of a narrow way of thinking of wrongs, because there are, more extensive, there are people who would add more things in there than can be classified as a harm. Like maybe you can, like, can you wrong someone after they've died, for example, when plausibly you can't harm them after they've died? If you speak ill of their reputation, does that wrong them? I would tend to say no, although it may wrong maybe their descendants or something, or you might say that it wrongs the people who hear that because you're telling them an untruth. But at any rate, we could argue about that, but at least most of the time, maybe all the time, I think that wrongs are done to people when you harm them or harm things they care about. But you can't harm God. I mean, I don't even know how you can, even if you harm things he cares about. I mean, he's God, right? He can't be affected by anything that we do. He's perfect. He is self-sufficient. He's omnipotent. I don't understand how any finite being could harm him in any way, even slightly. So how can he be wronged? Maybe you'd say that it's a special type of wrong that you can do in virtue of the fact that he's our creator, and so we have a duty to follow his commandments. I don't know. That just seems ad hoc to me. But why though? Maybe we can. So I think the way that does make sense to me is God's commandments are a way for him to tell us the best way for us to live. The best way for us to live is to live in a way that allows us to form a relationship with him. And if we diverge from that, then ultimately we're going to harm ourselves, maybe even others. And that's going to lead consequences. So this is kind of like the hell is locked from the inside kind of approach. So like, what's his face? Whoever that talked about this. The name escapes me. But anyway, and so C.S. Lewis, that's who I was thinking of. Yeah, the sort of C.S. Lewis idea. That kind of makes sense, although there's still problems there, but in my view. But the idea that a sin is somehow a wrong against God as God, and therefore he needs to punish us for that, I'm just not buying. Like, what is it to God if I do a wrong thing? I mean, he may be grieved because I'm harming my opportunity to form a relationship with him, which might be good for me. But it's not like God is going to be any the worse off. It's not like I can do something that's going to make God less perfect than he already is, or less happy or whatever than he already is. At least that's not the way I've always understood the way Christians talk about it. If I could do something that actually affects God, then that would be news to me. Like, I've always thought of God as impassible and unchangeable. So I don't know, this whole idea of being able to sin against God really doesn't make a lot of sense, at least in this context that requires there to be a punishment. And even if you want to say that we can in some way sin against God in a way that requires a punishment, even though we maybe can't harm God, but I don't know, for some reason we need a punishment, some unclear reason, why should the punishment be infinite? The classic argument is simply to say, well, God is infinite, therefore the punishment should be infinite. But I mean, that's like saying that I stole a marble, so the punishment should be round, because marbles are round. Like, that just, sorry, phone fell down. That's just infantile as an argument to me. I'm sure there are better arguments, but I'm just saying that's the one I've heard. It doesn't make any sense. The punishment should fit the crime, sure, but because you can't harm God because he's God, why should the punishment be infinite? I mean, if anything, it should just be proportional to how much we've harmed ourselves by, say, distancing ourselves from God or something. But that doesn't warrant an infinite punishment. That doesn't make any sense to me at all. So why can't we just bear our own punishments in the afterlife as appropriate, and then we can have a second chance or something to that effect? Like, why does there need to be a punishment that has to be infinite, and therefore only God can bear that punishment? And therefore he has to inflict it on himself, which also thereby means that we can kind of take advantage of that by faith. I mean, there's other issues there as well, but what does faith have to do with anything? But I think the whole thing is just not well motivated ethically. If you were an omniscient being, an omnipotent, omnibenevolent being, and you were sort of devising this system of how to save mankind and bring them back to yourself, I mean, would you really expect them to devise something like this, where there's this requirement for infinite punishment for things that don't hurt God, and then you have to sacrifice yourself in order to take this infinite punishment, and then require everyone just to kind of believe in you in order to get the advantages of that? None of this seems very well motivated to me. It seems very ad hoc, and I just don't know that the principles of justice or morality that are being appealed to here. Seems like a terrible system. Humans should bear their own punishments for wrongs that they've done, but those wrongs should only be things that actually harm other people. And since you can't harm God, I don't know how you can do a wrong against him. But if you can do a wrong against God, you should bear the punishment, not someone else. But that punishment should be proportional to the crime or to the wrong, and therefore will only ever be finite, because humans can't do infinite wrongs. So I just think the whole thing's a giant mess. Nothing about it makes any sense to me. And I'm sure there are other, well, I know there are other theories. I haven't talked about other theories of the atonement. I've just sort of focused on this one. But something like penal substitution, or there are variants of that. But so I think this is a major issue. And again, I think it's something that atheists, agnostics, and so on, why is this guy just standing in the middle of the road? Like, geez, dude. See, there's an infinite wrong right there, just standing in the middle of the road. No, but yeah, I mean, I think that it's something that we should bring up more and push Christians to give us an account of, look, if your religion entails this notion of the atonement in order for it to work, how do we make sense of it? And if we can't, well, then that's a reason to reject your religious claims, I think. Anyway, so I am just about at my destination. So hopefully you found this interesting. As I said, I'll try to do some more of these car chats as appropriate. There will be more videos of a more traditional thought coming up, though, so stay tuned for that. Thanks, everyone, for listening. Feel free to share your thoughts or ideas in the comments for future videos, or just, ideas for this one. And I'll take care of yourselves. Have a happy new year, and I'll talk to you next time. See ya.